All right, excuse me. All right, guys. Today, for this short little video lecture, I'm going to sort of close down Ibsen and finish up the conversation about him and move forward and talk a little bit about Chekhov to prep you for reading Cherry Orchard for the next class. So, we're going to find this pattern, this rhythm happening all semester. As soon as Ibsen develops realism, and gets his shop set up and writes his manifestos and sort of starts firing out plays in the style, people have some objections to it. They, as we discovered in class, they note some ways in which his manifestos don't actually meet the plays that he's writing, and so we get some reactions against this notion of Ibsen's realism. Some people can't help but notice that his plays are really artfully plotted, that they fit this clear Aristotelian structure, that they have a beginning, middle, and an end, that they have carefully placed revelations, and that they're just very thoughtfully, artistically put together. And they say, hey, Ibsen, if you want to claim that you're reproducing real life on stage, real life is not at all artfully plotted. So your whole well-made play or Aristotelian structure thing, I call shenanigans on your notions of realism here. They also note that everyday life is not artfully plotted, and everyday life is not also filled with quite so much action as an Ibsen play. We have letters written to people, we have lovers coming into town from years gone by, we have deaths and guns and all kinds of stuff, right? It's not quite as dramatic action-wise as melodrama, but it's close, say the critics. So they say, yeah, your realism is too artfully plotted, your realism is too action-oriented. Everyday life does not have a plotted, artful structure, and everyday life is not always suspenseful and action-oriented. They also note that though he claims to be open-ended in his plotting, Ibsen, actually, you claim that you're open-ended, but we can't help but notice at the end of A Doll's House, Nora's gone. That's pretty closed-ended. At the end of Hedda Gabler, Hedda's dead. That's pretty closed-ended. And they look again and again at this plays and say, if you really want to reflect real life, you can't neatly wrap everything up at the end. So, as soon as Ibsen creates this idea of realism, other people come along and say, yeah, we're going to try something different here. And we're going to talk in this class about two different reactions against Ibsen's realism. The first one is the play you're reading for the next class, Cherry Orchard, which is a great example of Chekhovian realism. Chekhov does domestic realism in many of the same ways that Ibsen does, but he has many key differences as well, and we want to focus on those. So Chekhov has a different take on realism. Again, some similarities to Ibsen, but some very new ideas that are different from what Ibsen was doing himself. And then the other reaction we get against realism is naturalism. And playwrights like Strindberg with Miss Julie come along and try to make a more hardcore, more gritty, more honest, more slice-of-life way of looking at the world in naturalism. So today, for this little lecture, we're going to talk about Chekhov's background, who he was, where he was coming from historically, and kind of how and why he wrote the way he did. And then as you read Cherry Orchard, it'll give you a little bit more background to sort of understand what you're looking at, what you're reading. Okay, there's Anton, looking dapper in his cool Russian coat and with his dachshund. My quote that I always use to introduce Chekhov is this one: write as much as you can, write till your fingers break, which overall is good advice for anybody who's writing anything or wants to be a writer, but also speaks a lot to, he didn't write very many plays because he died young, but he wrote all kinds of other stuff, so he was really obsessed with this notion of writing and telling stories. That's just sort of a trivial side note, but in any event, there's Chekhov and some really solid, well-groomed facial hair to keep that conversation going as well. So what's going on in Russia at the time of Chekhov's writing of the Cherry Orchard? This is important stuff because it's pretty historically specific in order to be able to understand who the characters are in the Cherry Orchard and what the heck's going on. So for a long time, a long time, Russia was dominated by this notion of serfdom. And there were a certain percentage of the population who were serfs. They were slaves. It wasn't based on race. It was basically just like a working class slavery. And you, as a serf, are tied to a piece of land that is owned by a noble. When that noble dies, his son inherits the piece of land. His son also inherits you. And so for centuries and centuries, Russian society was dominated by nobles at the top and serfs or slaves at the bottom. If you're a slave, And this is the one distinction from American slavery. You own the piece of land that you work on, you pay rent to the noble, you pay taxes, so you've got a financial model that you can actually kind of live on a little bit and have your own money, kind of. And the key part is that last notion where if you are a really economical, frugal serf, you can purchase your own freedom. American slaves obviously were never allowed to do that. So that's one of the distinctions between American and Russian slavery. So it's an extremely hard life. It's very much based in farming. It's very much based in relentless poverty. But there is that tiny possibility for upward advancement if you can buy your freedom. It almost never happened, but one of our characters in this play, he was formerly in a family of a serf, and that serf bought his freedom. So it's possible, but rare. In 1861, note, right about the beginning of the Civil War in America, so these racial and slavery-based issues are kind of going around the world right now. Tsar Alexander II decides that serfdom is no good. He frees all of the serfs. Now, this has an immediate political impact in that the people who were serfs are no longer owned, so that's a big deal. It's fantastically progressive. The wealthy people all of a sudden have a really difficult situation because the people they formerly owned can now sell their labor to the highest bidder. So if the noble that owned you isn't paying you as much as you like, you can go down the street or to the next town or village over and work for that noble because you're no longer tied down. So there's a lot of kind of chaos that results right after 1861 in terms of how things work out. However, as this next bullet point demonstrates, while political freedom is one thing, economic freedom is a different thing. And so the serfs are politically free and they can go around and sell their labor for a little bit more money here and there, but they're still basically unskilled manual laborers. And they continue to be really unhappy with their status. And this, again, we're talking about a significant percentage of the Russian population are serfs. So you have a whole lot of people in Russia who, all right, yeah, they're freed, which is good, but they don't make any more money, they don't have any better opportunity for economic advancement, so we have this continuing discontent in the working class people of Russia that eventually in 1917 leads to the Communist Revolution. Obviously it takes a while, but growing discontent is a big deal here. And what you have among the upper class then is also some really economic turmoil as the way they've been doing business and understanding the world for centuries and centuries changes almost overnight. They still, generally speaking, remain the upper class, but as we'll see in the Cherry Orchard, we're dealing here with an upper class family whose way of looking at the world and way of doing business doesn't work anymore. One of the big themes of this show, of Cherry Orchard, is how they deal with that huge change, or how they don't deal with it, as it turns out. This is just sort of a side note to help you not go insane when you're trying to figure out who everyone in this play is. Russian naming conventions are a little bit strange. Everybody in Russia, just like we do, has 3 names, right? And so we're going to take our major character, one of our central characters from the Cherry Orchard, Lyubov Andreevna Renevskaya. That's her full name, just like we have a first, middle, and last name. However, the way they get these is sometimes a little bit different. Lyubov is the first name, just like we have first names. Andreevna is a patronymic basis on the middle name. What you do is you take your father's name, and if you're a woman, then your middle name is your father's name plus Evna. If you're a man, your middle name is your father's name plus Evich. So we can look up back at Lyubov's name and say that her father's name was Andrei, because she's Lyubov Andreevna. And then Renevskaya is the last name. So it's that middle name that's kind of a different way that we do things. And the other aspect that we can note, and you'll see this throughout the play, is there are different ways of referring to someone as well. The most formal would be title and last name. So you'll see her referred to as Madame Renevskaya throughout the play. That's the very most formal sense. First middle, Lyubov Andreevna is kind of middle in terms of how formal we're being with somebody, and then but just a very straightforward use of the first name is very informal, or if you're talking down to somebody, condescending. I don't think anybody talks down to Madame Renevskaya throughout this play, but she does get spoken to informally by other family members. So it's always important as you read the Cherry Orchard to understand those naming conventions and pay attention to who is being called what by whom, and sort of talk about the insinuations that those titles might have on the relationship between the two characters. Okay, Chekhov's Realism. Here are two fantastic Chekhov quotes. He says regarding art, literature is called artistic when it depicts life as it actually is. A writer should be as objective as a chemist. There will be points in The Cherry Orchard where you will be driven crazy because it seemed like Chekhov just happened to sit a camera in the corner of the room of these people's houses and he turned it on randomly and turned it off. Sometimes we get a big revelation, sometimes big important things happen, and sometimes very little happens in the traditional sense. And that is where this notion comes from. A writer should be as objective as a chemist. Chekhov essentially says, it is my job to observe and to be as accurate and objective in my observations as I can. Social agenda. His second quote is also really interesting. He is correcting someone in this regard. He says, you are confusing two concepts, the solution of a problem and the correct posing of a question. Only the second is obligatory for an artist. So The Cherry Orchard does not, like all of our other plays this semester, does not propose a solution. It simply presents problems. It poses the question, hey, what's wrong with Russia right now? And answers that in a whole bunch of different ways. So those are two just interesting perspectives on where Chekhov is coming from as a philosopher, as a playwright, as an artist. All right, so we need to talk a little bit about Chekhov's theatrical style, which in many ways is similar to Ibsen, but in many other ways is very different and is a kind of a huge departure. So, rather than setting out to write a play that makes an explicit argument about something, like I said, Chekhov is just interested in observation, and you'll see that in his style. It's very much kind of what I just said, the notion that he walks into the room, flips on a video camera for a coincidental amount of time, turns it off, and whatever he sees, that's what he gets, and that's what you get on stage. So it really is objective observation rather than an agenda-oriented argument. Here's a big departure from Ibsen. Remember, one of the criticisms of Ibsen is that his plots were too Aristotelian and too action-oriented. So Chekhov responds to that by saying, look, life is not action-oriented, life is not Aristotelian, so my plays won't be either. And what you'll see a lot in Chekhov is a whole lot of different ways in which action doesn't seem to happen. And there are a couple different ways that he does this. So he takes the very direct action of Ibsen. Right? We can look at Ibsen, and all through Hedda Gabler, we see Hedda try different things and take action. We see other people do things. It's action, 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 and it's very tight, it's compressed. The plot is very Aristotelian. Instead, says Chekhov, if we're going to tell stories about life, then we need to be telling stories about the way life is. Things in life happen indirectly, he says. His plays have a much more episodic structure. And as you read Cherry Orchard, I want you to pay close attention to how much time passes between the acts. There is an indicator in the script at some point in every act as to how much time has passed. And we're going to talk in our next class about exactly what impact that episodic structure has in the storytelling. Characters in Chekhov love understatement. They will say something tremendously important, but say it in some offhand way. And he notes that people are very indirect in the way that they go about their lives. And understatement is one of those ways in which everyone in the world indirectly assesses what's going on in their lives. This notion of something big or important happened to me, or I feel very strongly about this, but I'm just going to understate it and kind of throw it out there. And look for moments of understatement in the play. Fragmented conversations. Another thing that will drive you crazy about reading The Cherry Orchard is the way in which the conversations don't always have a clear linear arc to them. It's not two people talking about one subject and coming to a resolution on it. It's fragmented. There are multiple people in a room talking about multiple topics. They interrupt each other. There are non sequiturs. There are places where it's clear that no one is listening to anybody else. Find me examples of those moments of fragmented conversation in The Cherry Orchard, because they're fantastic examples of Chekhovian realism. And I would also argue, when you're being driven completely mad by the fragmented conversation in Chekhov, go ahead and think about the way in which your own life, real life, features all sorts of fragmented conversations. The next time you're in a group of people talking, just shut up and listen. And you will notice that mainly people are talking about themselves, mainly people are not picking up on other conversation threads, and that they are as fragmented and chaotic as these conversations in Chekhov. we also get absent characters. Rather than every character being present and involved in a carefully orchestrated mechanical Aristotelian plot, Chekhov loves to give us missing characters who have a huge influence on the play. Because, frankly, the people who influence our lives aren't always around. Sometimes they're gone. Sometimes they're dead. Sometimes they're far away. And Chekhov says, look, if I want to write theater that reflects actual real life, I need to note and appreciate the influence of characters who are never around. So this notion of indirect action and these 4 different traits of it are key objects, or key items in Chekhovian realism as far as his style goes. And so as you read the play, come into class next time being prepared to give me one example of each of those 4 elements, and then draw a conclusion, right? So, all right, you're going to say, yes, this play has episodic structure. I will prove it to you. Then tell me, so what? And the so what of each of these Chekhovian stylistic elements, that's the other part of this we want to make sure we get to. Thank you very much for your time.